Hey, welcome everyone. I would like to welcome you on behalf of CRDCN to the 8th webinar in our series with the Journal of Canadian Public Policy. I will start by acknowledging that McMaster University, the host institution for CRDCN, is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. We begin the session by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations and to recognize our responsibility as guests to respect and honor the intimate relationship Indigenous peoples have to this land. We are going to use the Q&A function for asking questions for this webinar, and we will take questions from each presenter directly following their presentation. To begin, I'm going to hand off to Dr. Michael Veal, CPP editor, who will welcome our speakers.
Okay, so I will welcome the first two speakers, and then we have a subsequent talk as well. So the first talk is Income Inequality in Canada from 1982 to 2021, evidence from Distributional national accounts that appeared in Canadian Public Policy and Analyse Politique in the most recent issue. And we have two speakers, Camille Lajoie, who is graduated from London School of Economics and the University of Toronto, and Silas Xuereb, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And so please go ahead.
Okay, thanks Michael, and thanks Tess for organizing this. I will just share my slides here. And, okay. All right, so thanks everyone. Yeah, as Dr. Veal mentioned, our paper is called Income Inequality in Canada, Evidence from Distributional National Accounts, 1982 to 2021. So just to start with a bit of background about previous literature on income inequality in Canada, this paper is going to be mostly about estimating new estimates of top income shares in Canada. So this is a previous figure from Dr. Veal's paper in 2012, with the red lines indicate top shares in Canada. And so just to get an overview of the overall trend, we saw a steep decline in top shares at the end of World War II, followed by a kind of long period of lower top shares. And then we've seen a significant increase in top income shares since about the mid-1980s. So this increase over the past, since the mid-1980s, has been attributed to various factors, one of which has attributed a lot of it to increases in top labor incomes, partially attributed to competition with the US for top executives. Others have attributed this trend to skill-biased technological change or increased rent extraction power by top earners. And so in this paper, we're going to present new and updated estimates of top shares and explore whether this is consistent with these interpretations of this increase. And a key contribution of this paper is updating the methods used to estimate top shares. So a lot of previous research has relied on the longitudinal administrative data bank, right, which is a 20% sample of T1 tax filers that's available from StatsCan. And Statistics Canada actually now publishes top shares that's available online. Anyone can access it in their StatsCan tables using 3 different definitions of income for various groups of tax filers. But there's one issue that we're trying to address with distributional national accounts, which there was some attempt in this direction was made by Wilson and colleagues in a 2016 paper, who supplemented this LAD data with income from Canadian-controlled private corporations, right? So this, if you own a corporation, typically retained earnings in that corporation are not going to show up in income tax data. But Wilson and colleagues attempted to adjust these estimates of top shares for this income retained in CCPCs. But income retained in CCPCs is also not the only type of income that is not available in the income tax data that is present in the LAD. So in this paper, we're going to try to address this problem. So we use a method that has been created by the World Inequality Lab, which has launched this ambitious project to measure income inequality in a standardized way all across the world. And so the database now covers basically almost all the countries in the world, although of course with varying levels of reliability. And this paper is kind of the most recent Canadian contribution to this project. So we use the distributional national accounts methodology developed by the World Inequality Lab to distribute all of net national income to individuals. So I'll start by describing how we go about doing this process in Canada, and then turn it over to Camille to talk about some of our results. So just starting with kind of the basics, I can't get into all the details in 15-20 minutes here, but the key aggregate, what are we trying to distribute to all individuals, is net national income. So it's a close concept to GDP, but not quite the same. We remove consumption of fixed capital and add net foreign income to reach net national income. And this is what we try to distribute to the entire adult, which in the DINA method is defined as the 20+ resident population. So we don't consider children or family size, but we do consider spousal relations. So we will present results for 2 series, but the main benchmark DINA series uses equal split adults, which adds income amongst 2 spouses and distributes it equally amongst the 2 members of the couple. But we also will present results briefly about if we just look at individuals. So how do we do this in the Canadian context? So there's a few different data sources that we rely on. The key one is, again, the Longitudinal Administrative Data Bank. That's kind of the baseline here. We have income tax tabulations by fiscal income percentile from the LAD. But what we're adding here is linking in national accounts data, which largely comes from Statistics Canada, and we're going to try to distribute all the net national income that we can observe in the national accounts to the individuals in the income tax data. And we also sometimes take advantage of survey data to help us estimate the distribution of some of these other types of income that are not available in the income tax data. So this is just to give kind of an overview of what is and what is not observed in the income tax data. So this black line, if you can see, it's a little small, but the black line on this figure is the proportion of total net national income that we observe in the LAD each year. So it varies a little bit, but it's normally around 2/3 of national income. And so it's this missing third that we need to figure out how to distribute. And if we separate this income into capital income and labor income, the vast majority of the income, the vast majority of labor income is observed in the LAD, right, which makes sense. And it's a lot of the capital income that we're not going to observe in the LAD. So we start with the LAD tabulations, and then we try to match the population to the 20+ population in Canada. So we remove any people under 20, because there's some under 20 tax filers in the LAD. And then we impute the missing population over the age of 20, right? So not everyone who's a resident in Canada is observed in the LAD. Often we're missing around 5% of people. And we distribute these missing folks according to the income distribution of non-filers. That's from this 2015 paper. And then we recalculate these income percentiles based on this full 20+ population. And then we shift from this kind of fiscal income distribution to what DINA defines as the pre-tax national income distribution, where we're distributing all of net national income to individuals. And so there's a lot of steps in here, a lot of assumptions that have to be made in this process, so I can't go through all of them here, but I'll talk about a few of the more important assumptions that we make. So in the national accounts, we have corporate operating surplus, mixed income, and labor or employment income. And a lot of this mixed income is imputed rents in national accounts. And this is something that we don't, it's not a cash payment, so it's not showing up in the LAD. But we distribute this missing mixed income according to the distribution of home ownership from the Survey of Financial Security. And then later, when we talk about capital and labor, just to specify that we distribute this mixed income just according to convention, it is assumed to be 70% labor and 30% capital income. And then There's not a lot of missing labor income left. Pretty much all the labor income is observed once we account for non-filers and these imputed rents. But we just adjusted the observed data to match the national accounts totals there. The bigger question here is, how do we distribute this missing capital income, right? So some of this capital income accrues to pensions, and so we we distribute this income to match the distribution of pension wealth, which we can get from the household economic accounts. And then there's still a significant portion of capital income that's not owned by pensions that is corporate retained earnings. And so for this income, we distribute it according to a proxy for corporate ownership. This is where some improvements could be made, but we're assuming that basically stocks and Canadian companies are owned roughly in accordance with the distribution of dividends and capital gains. And then production taxes are distributed just proportionally to the distribution. So this just helps to give kind of the scale of these different components of capital income. So the green section is the portions of capital income that we actually observe in the LAD, right? People putting on their tax returns that they receive dividends or investment income. And then there's a lot of this income, and it's increased over time that is not observable here. And so you can see, especially in the early 2000s, there's a significant increase in these corporate retained earnings that are taking up a bigger portion of this missing capital income. And then finally, we also present some post-tax estimates. So we take the pre-tax national income distribution and then we remove different sorts of taxes that people pay and add in government transfers. And so here, this just describes how we distribute various different types of taxes. Personal income taxes are relatively straightforward because they are observed in the LAD. Corporate income taxes are not observed in the LAD, but we distribute them according to the distribution of corporate operating surplus. Property taxes, we distribute according to an average of rental income and real estate wealth from the Survey of Financial Security. And sales taxes are distributed according to basically disposable income. So what does DINA show us? These are just going to, I'm going to start by just showing a couple comparisons of top shares using DINA and then to other estimates, and then I'll turn it over to Camille. So if we start looking at this red line here, this is the estimate of the top share over time using just the LAD data for individuals, and then the blue line is using just the LAD data for the equal split adults. So you can see, which makes sense, when we switch to the equal split distribution, the top shares fall because there's some high earners who might have low earning spouses, so their incomes are being reduced. And then when we shift back to the DINA distribution, we see that there's an increase of a couple percentage points on average as we distribute this missing national income to these individuals. And largely this is because of the distribution of corporate retained earnings, right, which are disproportionately earned by top earners. And this is just to, again, compare to a couple previous estimates in the literature, just to show that they're relatively close to previous estimates, although we do see especially a bit of a gap between the DINA and Statistics Canada estimates of top shares, especially in the early to mid 2000s. And with that, I'll pass it to Camille to talk about the rest of the results.
So Silas just mentioned that we observe this gap that is increasing between other estimates and DINA estimates between the early 2000s and mid 2000s. So what explains this gap that we observe? As you can see in the figure, we are looking at the capital income for the top 1%, both observed and unobserved. And when we look at the unobserved, which is orange, you can see that there's a hump that is happening between the early 2000s up to 2010. So what is this increase saying is that during that time, we observed a lot less of the capital income that was happening, that was earned in Canada. And the reasons behind it are various, one being the shift between the bargaining power from employees to owners. But there was also a lot of shifts in the oil and gas industry during that time. And with Alberta representing more than 1/3 of all capital income in Canada, it is seeing these shifts happening also may have had an incidence on the unobserved capital income. And during that time, the corporate income was the highest we had ever seen it for until 2021 and 2022, and therefore we see that these earnings were very concentrated in the top income shares, and the retained earnings were very high, which explains that this hump that we see in the unobserved capital income, and could also explain the large gap we see with other estimates during that time. Silas, do you mind just changing the slide? Thank you. So now that we've seen a little bit of what drove the capital income variations throughout of the different years, let's see at what are the different drivers of the top income shares in the last 40 years. From the early 1980s to the early 1990s, most of the growth observed in the top income shares can be attributed to growth in labor income. But then this shifts following the early 1990s. From mid-1990s to the mid-2000s, we actually see, we can see it in the blue line, the capital income growth take off, and we can attribute the growth in top income shares to capital growth between the mid-1990s and the mid-2000s. Following the mid-2000s, both labor income and capital income decrease slightly, which leads to a little shrinking in the top income shares during that time. We can go to the next one, please, Silas. Thank you. Now that we've focused a little bit on the top income shares, let's look at the entire distribution and how that plays out. So we're looking at the top 10% of the income distribution, the middle 40, which loosely translates to the middle class, and then the bottom 50 for both pre-tax and post-tax DINA. And what we can see for the top 10% of the distribution reflects a little bit what we just saw, how there is growth in the top shares between the beginning of the 1980s until the mid-2000s, and then a slight shrink in their income share, which is also reflected in the top 10%. However, this happens to the detriment of the bottom 50%, which sees a decrease, and the middle class between the 1980s and the mid-2000s. However, when the top income shares start shrinking a little bit following the mid-2000s, we see that the middle 40% gains a little bit more income share during that time for both pre-tax and post-tax income. However, for the bottom 50%, we only observe this for post-tax income because there's this stagnation happening in their income share for pre-tax income, and therefore the slight growth they see following the mid-2000s can be attributed largely to redistribution efforts for this particular group. We can go on to the next slide, please. Resonating what we just talked about, we indexed the average income for multiple income groups for 1982, and we can see that the growth in different average incomes for the different groups varies a lot depending on the group. For the bottom 50 and the middle 40, we see very slight growth compared to other groups, even seeing the bottom 50s average income drop between the 1990s and the 2000s. And as the more we drive towards the top of the distribution, the more we see that the average income in these particular groups has increased drastically between 1982 and 2021, with the top 0.01% seeing more than triple its average income, pre-tax income in the 40 years we are studying. So that is drastic compared to the other groups in the distribution. So we can see that the growth is really unequal. So not only is the distribution unequal, but we're also talking unequal growth throughout income groups. We can go to the next one. And finally, where does Canada situate itself in the international context? Well, Canada's is the green line in this graph, where we're looking at the top 10% of share of pre-tax income, and we're comparing to DINA estimates for other industrialized nations. We can see that Canada is pretty much in the middle of all other countries except the US. I like giving the comparison with France, where Canada and France, the dark blue line, start very similar, but while Canada's top 10% share of pre-tax income increases, for France, we see that it it doesn't. We see a slight increase and then a slight decrease. So overall, little effect. So we can see that's from a very similar starting point. They end up at very different places. And for Australia, for instance, it also is, it's 10%, top 10% share of pre-tax income is also lower than Canada's. However, the growth it sees from the beginning of the 1980s is more important than what we see in Canada. And finally, there's always the US that stands out on its own, with it being already in a league of its own in the beginning, and its growth making the gap with other countries even larger by 2021. So what should we remember from this paper? First, we're going to go through limitations and how we can make this paper better. First, we used to create the DINA distribution of income, we used LAD custom tabulations. So we had contacted Statistics Canada and we asked for them to distribute the income equal split individual. And these custom tabulations, however, are categorized with Statistics Canada's definition of pre-tax and post-tax income. So when we apply DINA definition, we have to re-rank some earners that shift percentiles in between due to the fact that we're adding missing income, and these were not considered before. And all of these different aspects, we can shift people from different one percentile to another. And using LAD microdata in data research centers, could help us like make the results more precise in a sense, and allow us to avoid these re-ranking issues, which are technically based on hypotheses, and remove a little bit of precision from the numbers we have. And finally, when we distribute different types of missing income, such as corporate income, refinements can be done. Silas mentioned the proxy we use for corporate owners. We base them on hypotheses that they follow certain distributions, but we could push this further and make refinements to make the data more precise. So in conclusion, we see that distributional national accounts do demonstrate higher income shares in Canada than other estimates, especially during the mid-2000s, where there was a lot of concentrated retained earnings in the corporate sector. We also see that the growth in top income shares in Canada was initially attributed to labor income in the beginning of the 1980s to the beginning of the 1990s, but then was driven by growth in capital income until the mid-2000s, and then a slight shrink in the top income shares. And finally, to leave you on food for thought, there are estimates that rely exclusively on tax data like the LAD might underestimate the top income shares, especially during the pandemic, because we saw record levels of corporate earnings in 2021 and 2022, which could reiterate what we saw in the mid-2000s, where corporate earnings were very concentrated. And yeah, that is basically it. So if you have any questions, we'll be happy to answer them. And thank you for taking a little bit of time out of your day to listen to us today.
That was great. Thank you very much. I have the question and answer panel open in case people wish to ask questions. But while we see if they have any questions or not, I'm going to ask a couple. As I understand it, the way you dealt with the fact that there was capital income at the corporate level was that you redistributed the retained corporate earnings back, you attributed them to individuals, and then you used that to calculate your percentiles. What would you think about an alternative methodology that focused on capital gains, which would be the payments for capital that individuals actually received?
Yeah, so the capital gains is an interesting question. It's interesting because they're not actually included in national accounts, right? So, or at least in net national income, because they're kind of, this profit from the sale of an asset rather than this accrual of a new asset. So yeah, the DINA methodology sticks to this national accounts definitions. And the net national income does not include these capital gains. So that is a limitation, certainly, of this method, because there is some, literal cash income that some people receive that is not counted here. But the other, I guess, the advantage of doing it this way that I will point to is that capital incomes tend to be received in a lumpy fashion, right? People kind of record a $5 million capital income in one year, but no, capital gains, no capital gains in other years. And this way we kind of get to smooth that out a little bit. So in theory, by allocating the corporate retained earnings, we're allocating kind of those capital gains as people receive them, rather than allocating them in this kind of lumpy fashion.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. We have a question. Michael Wolfson, my co-author, one of the people that's been cited in this work. It's great to hear from you, Michael. And I read the question. Wonderful to see this analysis for the very rich. What about wealth held in private equity or trusts? And then do you have any concerns reusing the survey of financial, survey of financial security, which has relatively coarse brackets, I guess. Michael is guessing at fifth. I don't remember either, for allocating a portion of capital income. And then he adds, might as well get the other question out, and also wonders what you've done about private charitable foundation.
Yeah, so good question. So on the SFS fifth question, we do, I should have added more detail to the slide there. We have the pension income in quintiles, right? The pension wealth in quintiles. And then we also adjust within those quintiles roughly according to the labor income distribution. So that's kind of how it's a bit rough, but that's how we try to get more precise than that, just using the quintiles. On the other question, the wealth held in private equity and trusts, I suppose we don't do anything special for this type of income. My hope is that this type of income that accrues here, at least when it is properly, in Canada, we're not really accounting for offshore income, certainly, or wealth that accrues outside of Canada. We're talking about tax havens a lot these days. That might not show up in this data. However, corporate, I suppose the implicit assumption here is that the distribution of this private wealth in trusts that are in Canada is, follows the same distribution as corporate retained earnings, which again is debatable, I suppose, but that's basically, I think, what we're following here.
So I'm going to ask one more. I agree with Michael. Wonderful to see this analysis. If you were doing it again, I might suggest that when you're doing the international comparison, you were looking at the top 10%, where most of your rest of your analysis shows that the more striking results are in the top 1% or higher. And I was wondering if you'd get a different finding in comparing those countries if you were looking at the top 1%.
You know what? We actually have that. I think I can share that. I think this one. Can you see this?
Yes.
Yeah, so these are the top 1%.
And it basically says the same thing. So, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's great.
Of course.
All right. Not seeing any more questions. Let's go on to our second talk. But thank you very much, Camille and Silas. It was really great. Okay, so our principal speaker for the next one is Tammy Schirle. The name of the talk is Added Worker Effects in Canada, the Effects of Spousal Job Loss on Transitions into Employment. And one of the co-authors, Anna Ferrer, is also here in case that comes up for question. But the one thing I want to say is that Anna Ferrer is at the University of Waterloo, Tammy Schirle is at the University of Waterloo, Wilfrid Laurier University, and Tammy will be the next editor of Canadian Public Policy, Analyse de Politique, starting July 1. So she will probably be moderating the next one of these rather than me, and do a better job at getting titles and universities right. So go ahead, Tammy.
Thank you, Mike. I'll just thank everyone for joining us. It's nice to see a big crowd come in today, and everyone who organizes these webinars. I was thinking that CRDCN has really been central to the work that I've been doing for over 2 decades now. So it's good to be here. And also, of course, CBP is an important journal to me. So I take this opportunity to thank Mike Veal for his exceptional leadership while editor for the past 10 years or so now. So thank you for that. But today we are presenting our research on added worker effects. This is work that I did with Anna Ferrer and Annie Pan. This is a few years now that this project came together. All of this work was, of course, done here in Waterloo at the Southwestern Ontario RDC, which is also the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee people. Now, this is one article that was part of a much bigger project where we wanted to take some time to just think about how men and women might be moving differently through the labor market and focusing on those transitions between, unemployment, employment, and moving out of the labor force. And thinking about how women might be engaging in the labor market a bit differently from men. That bigger project, we benefited from some funding that was through the CRDCN and a partnership with the Department of Women and Gender Equality a few years ago. So that was nice to have that funding and start this project, keep it going. This paper is focusing on what we call these added worker effects. This is something labor economists talk about all the time. And very intuitively, you can just think about a family where we all rely on each other within the family for our well-being. And if perhaps my spouse were to lose their job, if I were a person who wasn't working, maybe I'd take up some work or increase how much I'm working to help support the family through that time. And we call this our added worker effect. Now, it's a pretty intuitive model to have in mind there, but it's also something we want to look for because it's important when we're designing some of our policies to think about how this plays through families so that different families have different experiences when a job loss happens. And here, for example, if we were to see this as a big effect, so families are able to self-insure in some way against these labor market shocks, we might end up with some inequality between individuals and families where the individuals don't have somebody to help support them necessarily. And that's where employment insurance is going to be much more important for that individual. We also might wonder whether different types of families are better insured than others. Who's able to respond when these shocks happen? And so these were the kinds of things that we were looking for here. Now, what we did was we went into the labor force survey. We started off looking at all the years since 1976, but we narrowed it down to the years 1987 to 2019. You might remember 2020 was a bit of a rough year that might look a little different than what is normal. So we decided to stop there. And we started in 1987 to make sure that we had some consistent variables to work with over time. We're going to be making use of the panel feature to the labor force survey, and I'll describe that a bit more in a moment. But really what we're able to do is see what people are doing in terms of employment or not being employed 1 month to the next, and we can connect people to their spouses and whether or not their spouse loses their job. So we're able to follow people a little bit over time. Now, we're trying to relate whether or not I were to find a job, right, go out and find employment 1 month to the next, to what my spouse might be experiencing in the labor market. Did they just lose a job themselves? Putting those two together and relating them to each other is really just a nice correlation that might not tell us a lot about this added worker effect very directly that we're looking for, right? It might just be the case that I'm the type of person who likes to move in and out of the labor market regularly, and I happen to have a spouse who's regularly losing their job. And so we just show up in the data that way, right? Rather than being the added worker kind of effect that we're looking for. And so what we've done in this paper is we've tried to do what we can to narrow our focus a bit. We only sample those individuals who have spouses with relatively stable employment when we first observe them in the labor force survey. We also try to separate different types of job loss. So did you just quit your job? Did you leave your job because there was a contract that ended? That would be our non-economic reasons. Or was it a business closure? Something like that, right? That gets us a sense of what types of job loss might matter here. And then, of course, we include what we can from the labor force survey to control for some of these other variables that might be capturing some of these personality or assortative matching types of issues. Now, to give you a sense of what we're looking at, this is just a mapping of what we call transition probabilities, where, for example, I'm going to take a group of people who were born in the 1950s, okay? They're in their early 20s, so we're looking at them in the 1970s at this point. We're going to take a group of people who are not employed in the month that we're pulling them out of the survey and say, what's the chances that when I see you next month, you're going to be having a job, right? And so for this group that was born in the 1950s here, that probability looks pretty low when they're young. But as they get older, you can imagine for this group of women, their children are also getting a little bit older. If they're not employed, they're becoming more and more likely to go out and find a job, right? Now, this changes from one decade to the next when we look at every successive generation, right? For the women who were born in the 1960s, that relationship between your age and your likelihood of going to find a job clearly changes. And by the time we're looking at the 70s and 80s, you're much, much more likely as a younger person to be finding employment if you were born in these later cohorts than the earlier ones. So we have this dynamic over time that is clearly changing. One thing I'll point out is that by the time we're looking at our folks that are born here in the 1970s and 1980s, this downward sloping line is, looks different in terms of the rates when it comes to men, but it has the same shape. Okay, for men, much more likely to be finding employment when they're young. And then if we don't see you employed when you're older, you're less and less likely to be transitioning into employment when we do see you. Now, what we want to use from the LFS is this panel aspect. You can't use that with the public use files. You have to get into the RDC to use this. But the nice thing about the LFS is that individuals first do this birth interview where they answer a lot of questions. Then they have a shorter interview that's repeated for another few months. And then they have their exit interview in the 6th month of the panel. In every single month, we ask people about their labor force status and a few, general questions about their jobs. What we're going to do in our study here is we looked at people in the 5th month of their panel. So they've already been around for a little while. We've taken a group who, in that month 5, say that they are not employed. Okay, and what we want to measure is whether or not they move from not being employed to being employed between month 5 and 6 of this panel. Okay, that gives us that transition that we're interested in looking at. What we want to do, though, is relate that to what's going on with their spouse, who's also answering these questions every single month. Okay, and we want to say, well, did your spouse lose their job last month? So here I am in April. Did my spouse lose their job between month 4 and 5, between March and April? Okay, and relate that to whether or not I find a job between now and May, okay, in the survey data. We have a time dimension to it, so we can say, well, what if your spouse lost their job a few months ago? What are you doing now when I see you in the 5th month? Okay, and so that's going to be sort of the general setup that we're going to bring into our model. This is the main table that we focus on in describing the results from our model. So we run this simple probit model. We're looking at, do you join a job, move from non-employment to employment when we see you in that 5th month? This is a sample of women that we're looking at here. And we're going to focus on whether or not your spouse lost a job in the previous months. Okay, so month 4 to 5 here would say, did your spouse lose a job last month? Okay, or did your spouse move away from employment a few months ago? Okay, the main results are here in this row that I just highlighted. If we don't control for much, we just really have a few basic, education. Do you have kids? What's the age of your youngest kid? Kind of controls in our probit model. The marginal effects that we see here tell us that if you are a woman who is not employed and your spouse lost their job just last month, you are going to be 3.7 percentage points more likely to move into employment when we're looking at you between months 5 and month 6. And that's pretty big given the transition rates that we were just looking at. That's a very large effect. Now, this is where I'll just pause and point out that at CPP, we've been fortunate to have incredible reviewers. We had great referees on this paper who really pushed us in thinking hard about what we can and can't say out of this data and what we're controlling for. And I just wanted to point out that we actually really appreciated the many comments that we got. But one of the things that we realized was really important in interpreting these numbers is that we have to think about the differences across these women and how long they have been without a job. Because we know from, a broad literature that the longer a person has been away from work, the more difficult it is to find yourself a job again, right? That unemployment duration matters. So we control for that. We can see, these estimates tell us that story that we would expect. And once we do control for that, when women are responding to the fact that their spouse just lost their job here the month before, they have a 1.2 percentage point increase in their likelihood of moving into employment. Okay. Now going from there, we can try to control for a lot of other things. We can bring in things like our spouse's characteristics, the unemployment rate in your region. We've got economic region, time fixed effects, all these sorts of things. The estimates we're getting don't really change after that. So this is really the key result. One of the things that we think is really important to highlight, if you were to go through the details of the paper here, is that we tried to separate out the spouses that just had job separation for whatever reason, whether they quit or whether they were fired, whatever it could be. We separated out the people who lost their jobs for what we call non-economic reasons. So maybe they were just dismissed, they were simply fired, maybe a contract ended, other such things can happen. And then there's also a category that we call economic reasons. So maybe the business shut down, there was a closure, the company had to move. Those are the more exogenous reasons for having a job separation. The numbers that we're seeing here and these effects that we're picking up are really being driven by these folks who are leaving their jobs for non-economic reasons. The spouses are leaving their jobs for non-economic reasons. And that's really driving these results. So it's an important thing to think about, because when we look at the job loss literature and we're looking for that exogenous job loss and having an effect on a family, that's not where we're seeing an effect here, right? This is when you kind of go through it all, you can think of there being a family where that job loss is somewhat expected, right? Either it's regularly happening in your household, maybe you know that that contract's ending, you're anticipating it. And when it happens, there's this group of people who are ready to step up as spouses and take on some extra work. So that's the main results that we have there. I just kind of point out, we want to get at this idea that maybe different families are more or less able to respond when that type of layoff happens in their household. So we started cutting the data by different groups. When we cut our sample of women according to their education, we found that it was really a big result here for these highest educated women. So these are women with university degrees or more. Our lower educated women, if we call it that, is people with high school or less. But it's really thinking here in that, if your spouse lost a job between months 4 and 5, what are you doing in month 5? That big response is really representing what highly educated women are doing. So they're able to respond very quickly when their spouse loses work. We also cut the data according to how much the spouse had been earning when we observed them at the beginning of the LFS panel. Here we have a high wage group is a top quartile of the wages that we are observing. The low wage group is the bottom quartile. That's how we split people up. The big response that we see here in that quick response to a job loss is really happening for those women who have high wage spouses. So we have highly educated women with high wage spouses that are appearing to be the most likely to become added workers. We then also could look at things like home ownership. This is one of the questions in the labor force survey. Are you owning your home or are you renting? And this is again where we could see it was the women who were in a home that was owned by their family, who were the ones who were most likely to respond as added workers when their spouse lost their job. And it's that same quick response, right? You lose your job just the previous month, your spouse loses their job the previous month, and you respond pretty quickly to find some employment. So you have this picture then that it's really those highly educated women with high wage spouses in the home ownership group who are the ones being able to work as added workers. And so I've clearly talked way too quickly, but that's okay. We'll have lots of time for questions. One of the things that we started to dig into was, well, okay, how long are they actually working afterwards? What types of jobs are people getting when they appear to be these added workers. There's a lot of information in this page, but what we did was we took out the group of women who appeared to be added workers. So they're just finding employment. We can see that their spouse had lost a job. It looks like these are happening around the same time. So we're gonna call that our added worker group. We're gonna compare them to the women who just found employment. Their spouse didn't do anything special in the past few months, right? They're just finding employment. What do their jobs look like? Okay. Now, when we split those groups according to the women's education, those women with that higher education seem to be able to find pretty good jobs when they're coming in as added workers compared to the women who are just coming into the labor force or coming in to find employment for no particular reason. They have higher wages. They seem to be finding full-time work with more hours per week, and they appear to be more likely unionized than those who are not coming in as added workers. And so this is kind of interesting. We also see something similar when we're looking at those homeowners, might be very much the same group, so at least some good overlap there. And when we're looking at the women whose partner is in that higher wage group, or at least above median there, these women are finding those higher wage jobs that are more likely full-time with higher hours and in unionized positions. And so it creates this interesting picture where we can imagine, there's this group of women who are already in a pretty good position in terms of their household, who are also the ones most likely to be able to jump into employment when something happens to their spouse's job. And this is a pattern that we would find in the data. So just to summarize the key results that we have in this paper, we find that there is this small but quick and significant added worker effect in employment. I'll point out, we didn't share here the evidence that we had on hours. We did not find any evidence that people will increase their hours in response to a spouse's job loss. And there's no effects here for men in the background as well. We did investigate that. Now, for Canadian women, they are responding. It's a quick effect. It's stronger for those more educated women. It's stronger for those who are homeowners, and also for those whose spouses have higher wages. And I want to emphasize this result that, what is this really telling us about people? It doesn't seem to be the case that if your spouse were to lose their job in a completely unexpected way, that you're going to be a person who's going to be able to find employment any faster. That's not the people that we're talking about here. We're talking about people whose spouses are leaving their employment in a fairly predictable way, at least relatively, compared to, a business closure or something like that. And those are the women who are most likely to be moving in and out of employment. And this seems to be a thing that they're fairly well prepared to respond to. So that's where I can end here. There's of course other things in the paper if you're interested, but I'd love to open it up to questions.
So we have a couple of questions in the chat, and please add more. To my awareness, this is from Michael Labenbaum. To my awareness, there are no IDs available to convert cross-sectional labor force survey to panel, and this must be constructed from other characteristics. What approach did you use to do this? How challenging would you say this is to do?
So if you were to try and take our cross-section files from the public use microdata files, and try to do this analysis, that's exactly the kind of thing you'd have to do. You'd have to try and match people according to characteristics, and it's not going to work out very well. But if you go into the RDC and you get to see the confidential files, there are person IDs and various bits of information that you can line up to merge files over time from one month to the next. It's really easy to do for more recent files. That person ID has been constructed and stored so that you can easily merge the 6 months worth of files. If you want to go further back in time, I will suggest, getting some hints from people who have done this coding. Anna and I certainly, and Annie too, of course, did a lot of coding to get that all to match going historically. And there is, of course, a publication by Pierre Brochu looking at the labor force survey from just a few years ago that really kind of tries to pin down some of these details that you need to watch for if you're doing that. But it's entirely possible to do within the RDC.
Now, let me just quickly point out that publication by Pierre Brochu is also in Canadian Public Policy and Inequality. And also, just in case there's somebody on this who's not aware of our procedures within RDC, what Tammy described, the use of confidential data, that does not, of course, mean the revelation of anybody's individual data. We have procedures within the RDC, including vetting by Statistics Canada analysts to ensure that that information is not released. It's the confidential data can be used to produce aggregates to produce the kinds of results that Tammy is referring to. Okay, the second question, very interesting result. Oh, for Michael Wolfson, very interesting results. For an out-of-sample comparison, are you aware of any similar analyses using the General Social Survey, Family History Survey type recall questions? And he just notes these data are over years, not for 6 months, and but they do have lots of covariance.
Yeah, so I haven't tried using that myself. I do find that surveys asking about recall often miss those short events, so if your spouse were to lose their job for only a couple of weeks and maybe you respond quickly, by the time you get to the survey next, year when you're filling that in, I'm not sure that those details are always captured. So I'm gonna check out that GSS Family History Survey. That might be interesting to think about. There has been some analysis at the annual level. There's a paper by, help me out, Anna, Morissette, and one of his co-authors. Anyways,
Yeah.
they looked at the annual earnings of families to look for added worker effects, and they really didn't find much. They had to really narrow their groups down to some smaller group of people to find some effects there. But then you're missing, again, you're looking at that bigger annual picture, but missing some of those details in between. So I think this was one of the benefits to using the LFS, is that we could get those questions asked every single month. You don't have to recall what you were doing a year ago. Especially, several months ago, it can get a bit blurry. At least it is in my mind. I don't know. Anna, did you have something to add?
Yeah, well, I have to say that I haven't used this particular general social survey, but I have used others, and it's usually a bit of a challenge because of first of all, the recall, the type of questions they ask, they may not be as specific, and you may not be able to link the specific employment status you have now with whether or not your husband lose their job anywhere. So I'm not sure, but we will have to look at the questionnaire to see if anything is available. And by the way, the paper is by Morissette and Ostrovsky. It's a Statistics Canada paper, and I was going to post it on the chat, but I don't think I can do that. In any case, if anybody is interested, it's Morissette and Ostrovsky, 2008. It's a Statistics Canada paper.
I always find that cited in our paper as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah.
Janice Compton has a question. Thanks. Interesting paper. Did you find an effect by presence of children? Is there any evidence of this being a within family switch from stay-at-home moms to stay-at-home dads?
So we went through many iterations of this over time. Anna might recall better than me. We do control for the age of the youngest child. And I recall when we were looking at transition rates and comparing across family status and according to how many children and the youngest age of children, there were clearly differences in the transition rates themselves. I recall, Anna, that we did cut the data by, whether or not it looked like you might be. We never know if somebody's really an at-home parent or just not employed at the time, right? But we did do some cuts by children. I don't recall there being anything worth reporting there.
Yeah, but I mean, that can be just because there were so very few observations to look at, but we couldn't find anything significant. That is right. We did cut. Just cutting by the number of children and whether the child is under 6 or so. But we didn't find anything there. And again, that can be because of the small number of observations.
Mm-hmm.
Michael Wolfson just adds into this discussion about the GSS that when they built the Life Path model at StatCan in the 1990s, they used both the 6-month LFS panel microdata that you're using, but also the GSS FHS data, Family History Survey, in some joint method, although he didn't remember the details. So that's just another pointer along that along those lines.
Mhm.
Not seeing any other questions. I'll just ask one here, I think, and that is there a way we could think about figuring out whether this is an effect that's largely based on the labor supply side of the model or on the labor demand side, by which I mean maybe there are other spouses who would like to get jobs in these situations, but they're not able to because it looks like that they have perhaps less desirable employability. And so that they're not able to get the sort of jobs that fit into the hours that are going to work for them, or wages that make it worthwhile for them. Is there any way we can figure out whether that's what's going on?
So, I mean, I want to default saying it's probably a bit of both, right? You know, if you are a person who has a university degree, maybe you're also just of the type of person who is more likely to be going out to find employment, right? That's on the supply side. On the demand side, though, you might also have the skills that some employer is looking for, short-term or long-term, and that's going to make it easier to find that job. I don't know, Anna, maybe you have something more coherent to say about that.
No, I think we talked a lot about this and we tried to find something that could help us control, but the only thing that we could put in there as a control was the unemployment rate, just as a measure of how the economic environment is in terms of are there any jobs available, but that is a very gross measure. It doesn't actually go to what Mike is saying, I don't think. But yeah, I guess now that if you go ahead and do all these things that my students know how to do in terms of scraping data from the internet, maybe you could get something from job ads or something that actually tells you a little bit about the demand side of the labor market. But yeah, we didn't do anything like it.
Yeah, perhaps I'll just add, like we did, you know, work for a while with how to add these controls we had unemployment rates within economic regions and the economic region fixed effects and things like this. And how we set those up didn't make a huge difference for the coefficients that we were getting.
We have a question from Luann Good-Gingrich. Did you compare the added worker wage level to the spousal wages before job loss?
No, this is something that we actually thought about doing, and it was supposed to be a different paper. I think just to see how, you know, how people actually move when they go back to the labor market. But we didn't move forward with that, not for this paper for sure. But because it is kind of tricky to compare the wages before and after, because the other worker may or may not have a previous wage in the LFS. It depends how long ago they have been employed. And there was some questions there about how to calculate or compare those wages. Yeah.
Okay, seeing no further questions, I would first like to thank our audience for coming here today. I would like to thank the questioners. We had some excellent questions, and thank you so much for that. And of course, I'd like to thank our contributors, Silas, Camille, Tammy, and Anna for their excellent contributions to this continuing series. So
I would like to thank you, Mike, for all of the CPP webinars so far. It was great working on these with you, and I look forward to working with the new editor.
All right. Thanks very much, Nat. And thanks for everyone again for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.